Yeah, so now I would like to ask Kevin to give his talk. Kevin, maybe you also introduce yourself. You're from the Digital Curation Data Center.
I'll say a little about that in my first few slides. So thank you for inviting me. I'm Kevin Ashley, as you can see here, from something called the Digital Curation Centre at the University of Edinburgh. Just before I begin, I'd like to have a reaction to that comment there about who's sharing their data and who isn't, and about the reasons why the engineers don't. So I can understand all this stuff about patents and everything else, and yet I'd observe that a lot of engineering companies are investing a lot of time and effort and money in managing their research data because they see the value of that data for them for the future. Even they want to share it with themselves, even if not somebody else. So I've got a slightly different title for my talk from the one in the programme. I was asked to pick up on some contemporary issues, so I'm going to it's a selection really of some information about things that are happening with regard to research data management in the UK and elsewhere. That's the news, and a few perhaps more of my own personal opinions on some of the things that are happening. So I'm going to say a little about where I'm from, this place called the Digital Curation Centre, and return to reminding us, and I apologise if I repeat myself, some of you have heard me speak before about why we care about this, and we heard from Stefan and Bert about that focus on reuse, really an important issue. I'll say a little about what's happening in the UK, talk a bit about the costs of research data management and how we deal with those, about some national services, and a very little about international work if we have the time to do that. So I work for this organisation called the DCC. It's a national service in the UK, and our role is to increase the capability, the capacity for management of research data in UK research institutions, mainly universities. But clearly our funding is for the UK. We're meant to make a difference in the UK, but this is not just a UK problem in the same way that it's not just a problem in North Rhine-Westphalia. The action we need to take here is often international. So we often need to work on an international level. We produce some training, some shared services, guidance, policy, standards, and we do a little bit of looking into the future. And that strapline from our website, really summarises a lot of what we're about. Good research so often depends on good data, whether it's your own or whether it's someone else's, whether it's come from another researcher or come from another source. So I mentioned that international working. This is just a selection of I'm not going to really talk about any of these in detail, but try to give you an impression of how many different organisations, projects, whatever, are working internationally. That's by no means all of them. These are just some of the people we've worked with over the past few years. So I mentioned we produce a good deal of guidance. These are some examples. All of this material is freely available. I hope some of you may have seen some of this information about data licensing, about training, both for early career researchers and for the professional staff who need to work to provide research data services, on appraisal and selection. I'll say a little bit more about that later. An example there of one of our national services, DMP Online. I'll be saying more about that as well. And all of that material, on my own knowledge, is available through our website. So we talked a little about data reuse. We heard about data sharing to enable reuse, because that's where we really get the value of this investment in research data management. And there are so many anecdotes one can give about how this happens. Unexpected cases of data reuse, which aren't just happening within a single discipline, but are happening across disciplines. These are just some examples. Paleontologists, people who work with dinosaur bones, with things that are hundreds of millions of years old, who manage to save a huge amount of research effort by using data from archaeologists. Data that's only from the last 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 years about human history. These are not groups that usually work together. A fascinating tale from the Netherlands about where information that helped us understand the distribution of dust from that volcano in Iceland. I'm not going to try and pronounce that one for the moment, but I'm sure you can do that for yourself. But that's where the noise in their data, the information they were throwing away, because these researchers were interested in rain formation in clouds, actually turned out to be the data that could tell us about where the dust was. And many, many, many other examples. This is why we're doing this. And it's important to remember that it is about the data here. In many of these cases, the publications originally produced from that data would not have helped the other researchers. They were finding things in that data that the original researchers did not. What they needed to know was not what conclusions did you draw from your data, but how did you collect your data? How accurate is it? What is its coverage? How precise is it? That's what I need to know to reuse your data, not what conclusions you drew from your own research. And if we get all of this right, we can improve all of these things. We can improve the quality of the research we do, because with more data, hopefully we can get closer to the truth that we're all trying to get to. We can improve the speed with which we do our research if we can avoid the need to collect new data and instead reuse someone else's, even though reusing somebody else's data can be harder work than using our own. And we can improve the costs of doing research, either with we can do more research for the same money, or if, as is often happening now, the amount of money is shrinking, perhaps at least we can still do the same amount of research with slightly less money. But let's focus on that. Let's do more research with the same amount of money. I'll prefer that particular story for the moment. So improving all of those things, this is good. It works for everybody involved. It's good for the research funders like DFG. It's good for us as researchers to be able to work more quickly and produce better research. And it's good for the places we work at. If we can improve all of these things, we're not working against each other here. This is not something where what benefits me doesn't benefit you. So it should be easy to get all this right, because all of us have the same goal in mind, and the benefits are there for society as well. We already have a good deal of evidence that doing this right benefits society. There's a series of studies done in the UK, the link is there at the bottom. I just looked at existing research data centres, places like the Archaeology Data Service, you're going to be hearing about them tomorrow, the British Atmospheric Data Centre, you're also going to be hearing from Sarah Callaghan, and looked at, in a sense, as what return do we get? What value does the investment that goes into these data centres generate? It shows huge rates of return. If these were private companies, the hedge funds would be piling in with their money. 400% to 1,200% rates of return. You get 12 times as much value back as you put in. That's a very, very powerful benefit. That suggests we should be doing a great deal more of this. But unfortunately, not every domain of research has these data centres, and as we've heard, it can be difficult sometimes to create them, and that's why there's a role also for universities at the moment, their libraries and others involved, to take care of the data that doesn't have a home elsewhere. Interestingly, the methodology that was used to do this study is freely available, and we'd be really interested to see it applied outside the UK. I'm sure this story is repeated if it's done elsewhere, but we'd like the evidence really to see that it's not simply a British phenomenon. So if anybody from Germany or elsewhere would like to take that methodology and use it, please do, and please let us know when you've done it. And just to finish off that tale about reuse, I'm not going to go into this diagram in any detail. This is from a report about e-science and data curation from 2003. And what's interesting in that is this statement at the bottom about who are the end users, the consumers of the data we produce. And notice there that it's not just about other researchers, it's not just about our peers. It's stressing that there's a public interest in data reuse. There's interest from industry as well. To get the real benefits, we need to see data flowing back and forth between the public sector, government and administration, industry, and the public research sector. There are some other reasons to be interested in this as well, to do with research integrity and avoiding fraud. Some of you may be familiar with the Journal of Irreproducible Results. I recommend it. It's a very entertaining read. On the other hand, it's not the ideal journal perhaps to aim to publish in. it's important that our research is reproducible. And we've got lots of evidence that making data available is a very, very powerful way to avoid scientific fraud. And the consequences of not making data available can be serious, and it's not just about the reputation of an individual. And conversely, coming back to that thing about incentives, we also know that reproducible research is more likely to be cited. So again, a very positive reason for doing the right thing, a negative reason for doing the not. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into these in more detail. There are some references there. I'll focus perhaps just on one of these, the one in the middle, the Duke case. This is described in a blog post I wrote on the DCC website and in more detail elsewhere. Some of you may have heard about a sequence of trials published from Duke University in the US, which is now potentially costing that university huge amounts in lawsuits. It related to treatments for cancer, which appeared to show huge benefits from a particular treatment that was then given to a number of people with late stage disease. Many other researchers were dubious about the claims and wanted to try and challenge that research, spent a long time trying to get at the data behind it. Barrier after barrier after barrier was put in their way. It took many years for people to get hold of that data and finally demonstrate that these treatments were at best worthless and actually seemed to be making the situation worse, which is why the university involved is now being sued for large amounts of money. If we'd had a culture of making that data available, none of this would have happened. It's likely that those involved would never have dared perpetrate that fraud when they knew the risk of being found out. And all those other cases tell us a similar sort of story. If you're interested to know more about, particularly in medical research, the real issues around this and the problems we face, reading Ben Goldacre's book Bad Pharma is well, I wouldn't say it's an entertaining, it's a really worrying read in many cases about the problems we get, not just with not sharing data, but not sharing data is a big part of what he focuses on. And that's one initiative just in one area of research, something called All Trials, which is trying to get just the idea that the data that comes from every clinical trial is registered and made available somewhere. Something that amazing. We spend huge amounts of money on this research, and in many cases we know nothing about what comes out of it because it's funded by industry, and if the results don't match the story they want to tell, it's simply buried. So I'll say a little about what's going on in the UK at the moment, some particular activities. One of the things that we do at the Digital Curation Centre, as I said, we're meant to help universities increase their capability and capacity to manage data. That can range from simply helping to make the case, from advocating with helping senior management understand that there needs to be a commitment to doing something, moving on to assessing the needs, simply working out how much data have we got at the moment, where is it, who thinks they're responsible for it, and scoping the problem initially and then trying to decide what services you need to build around that. Looking at workflows, building things like institutional data catalogues. Whoops, seem to have leaned on something that I shouldn't have done there. And then finally moving on to developing and supporting services and producing things like customised data management plans. There's a lot more detail about what we do with individual universities there and some case studies around that. But the picture is still, it's very varied, I would say, with universities across the UK. We've worked with about 60 so far. There are probably still another 60 that will want our assistance. But the idea is the more we work with particular universities, the more we can learn from them and help others to build on what goes on there. Quite recently, in fact in the past week, JISC, the funding organisation that's behind us, and a lot of the other work that's been done on research data management in the UK, announced a new funding programme, something called the Research Data Spring. And this diagram is meant to give an indication of how this is going to work. There's a call at the moment that's open for proposals until the 12th of January. But unlike the sort of funding calls that JISC have done in the past, where simply you send in a proposal and a committee looks on them and marks them and the top few get funded, This is going to involve a process of successive refinement, where the initial set of proposals are looked at in a workshop, people get to talk about them, and some are reduced, and then all of those are involved are given 3 months to work up and begin to test their ideas out in a pilot. And then there's another workshop, and again some of the less promising ideas are taken away, and some more money is then given to the few that remain. There are 3 successive stages of refinement over 2 years, the end being projects that are likely to turn into services and infrastructure which others will want. But everybody gets some chance to get some money to at least pilot the ideas, and we can learn even from those that perhaps weren't successful and made it through to the end. And although that's a UK funding programme, I did mention, and the projects have to be led by a UK university, this is an international problem, and I think if any of you are interested in collaborating with people in the UK, we'd be happy to help broker the conversations and see if there's a possibility for collaboration there, perhaps even, I don't know, collaboration through DFG as well, through the open call that they mentioned. There are particular areas of interest that JISC is interested in funding here, and this describes them. Research, data deposit and sharing, the mechanisms and the workflows to do that in different disciplines. Data creation and reuse by discipline, what can we do that's generic and what needs to be done that's very specific to particular areas of research. Integrating research data systems. We have at the moment a big array of both administrative systems that relate to doing the right things by the funders, what we call research information management systems, as well as the ones that are used by researchers, and as well as the things that we use for things like research data management planning. And so integrating those, ensuring that researchers don't have to give the same piece of information again and again to different administrative systems is an important thing. Research data analytics, that's helping us, for instance, count how often data is reused, get some idea about how much of the sharing we're really enabling. And in all those areas, they're interested in generating and funding shared services, things that could be used by more than one university. So there's a lot more information about that available on the JISC website. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about costs, something that came up in the questions for DFG, and this is going to be slightly a UK take on this, but I think as we realise there, these issues are very generic. And I'll say, mention first a plug for something I'm involved with, as is Marianne Grotfeld is going to be speaking tomorrow, a project called 4C, comparing the costs of curation, that's not just interested in the cost of research data, but the costs of managing information in general over the long term. They built something called the Curation Costs Exchange, which encourages people to share their own information about long-term data management costs as a way basically of helping us all understand this problem in greater depth. We've taken this approach because we realise that other attempts in the past to produce single models to understand costs have not been successful, and that instead using an information sharing approach might be more useful for everyone. So I encourage you to contribute information to that and to learn from us. One of the things that we've learnt about this is, paradoxically, the better we get at research data management, the more data we are going to throw away. We're not going to be keeping more data, we're going to be discarding more data. And the simple reason for that, as illustrated by this report, Riding the Wave, is that technology is allowing us to produce data far more quickly than our computer systems are able to deal with it. And we're producing data more quickly than our ability to store it. If we don't get good at throwing information away, we're going to end up consuming our entire research budget simply on keeping it, on locking it away, not on sharing it or doing anything useful with it. Clearly we can't do that. So the task then is not simply to randomly lose stuff, but to begin to make more intelligent decisions about what we keep and what we throw away. That's one of the aims of this guide that we produce, how to appraise and select research data for curation, how to make decisions about what can be kept. These are not going to be perfect decisions. There will always be cases where we throw something away and years later regret it. That experience tells us that this is what libraries and archives have been doing for years. It's impossible to get this absolutely right. But at least it's good to have a process and to document our decision-making process so that others don't waste time searching for something which we know has been discarded. So I'll explain a little about this funding model that we've got in the UK that supports universities. It's one of these things where money comes from two sources, and I think you have something not dissimilar in Germany, where you have research funders that fund specific projects, and you get chunks of money associated with a project that's time limited. And we have national bodies which simply provide the money for universities to exist. It's a continual stream of funding that grows and shrinks, perhaps related to the number of students or to the quality of your research, but it's more predictable than the project-related costs. And countries vary a bit, but all of them have these complexities and money coming from different sources. Now, that project funding typically can only be spent while your project is going on costs that you can definitely show are directly related to what you're doing. It also comes with what we call overheads, that money that's meant to pay for the fact that I have a desk and a telephone and all these things, and perhaps the fact that I have a research data management system as well. And there's also an element of that other national funding called QR money in the UK, which is also expected to be spent on the infrastructure costs of research, on having good laboratories, on having a decent library. It's meant to support what we might call the business as usual, having what's called the well-found research laboratory. So there are lots of competition inside universities for how that money is spent and how it's related to project funding. Research data management is just one of the competing priorities there. So we have this problem, as I mentioned before, that we often have costs in managing data that go beyond the end of a project, but we can't use the project funding to do that. That creates an incentive for people to have services where you pay a sum of money once and they take care of your data for a long time. Because suddenly now this is something that you can put in the project costs, and people like DFG, as long as we don't explain too much about what's going on, they'll be happy to see that appear in the cost. You didn't hear about me explain all the detail of this. This gives us a strange... now, in cases where you've got funders who pay for infrastructure, these things we have like the Archaeology Data Service and the British Atmospheric Data Centre, universities don't need to worry about that. Data is already going to go somewhere else. The funder pays for that infrastructure to take care of it. But as we've heard before, there are many other cases where the universities are taking care of it, and now we're beginning to see commercial players emerge to provide those pay once, store forever data services. In the long term, I think this might cost us more, even though the funding system somehow gives us an incentive to behave in that way. So I'll just say a little bit in the interest of time. I won't go into too much details on this, but this tries to explain some of the complexity of what you're allowed to spend different bits of money on in different project costs. Let's imagine the bottom axis is time and the axis up the side is resources. We have this idea that there's business as usual. Perhaps in some universities it's an amount of storage. Every researcher, let's say, gets a terabyte of storage for research data. That's paid for out of overheads. That's normal costs, and therefore they don't appear in the bills that go to DFG, because that part of storage is what every researcher gets. It's normal. And that red line is meant to show the amount of data we're using over a project, and at some point it crosses over that line of business as usual. It goes into it's more than a terabyte. per researcher. So this is now an exceptional cost. We're allowed to put that into the project funding because it's not like a normal research project. So is it that extra bit that we put in the project funding, or is it now all of the storage costs? Nobody really knows the answer to that yet. We've got to see some examples. And of course we've also got those costs beyond the end of the project that we can't put in the project costs. And I'm worried, as I said, about this potentially this incentive to do outsourcing and the fact that we're not actually minimising the total cost. We've got commercial services, Figshare, which is operating internationally, Archivum, currently only in the UK, but I've already seen them begin to sell their service in the States. I'm sure they'll be trying to do it in the UK as well. They're just two examples of the commercial players. There are many, many more beginning to operate. They see money in this. And in some cases they can do something at a scale and at a cost that it's difficult for us to do inside the university. But I'd worry about too much of our research data moving in to that commercial infrastructure. I need to move on because we're eating into lunchtime. Something then about some of the national services around research data discovery is one key one. It's not enough to keep this stuff. If we want to share it, we need to be able to find it. The Australians, I think, have been leading the way on this with Research Data Australia. We've seen something similar happening in the Netherlands. We're copying the Australian approach in the UK through what has been a pilot project, and this is definitely something where we'd like to coordinate with other countries and make sure that we're all approaching a similar problem in a similar way. Dataverse is a service that came originally from the University of Hartford, funded with NSF money, designed to make it easy for researchers to share and publicise their data. This is an example of a Dataverse page for a single dataset. Interestingly, a dataset that was published before the paper that related to it was published, and as a result got a lot more attention than it might otherwise have done. This is now being used in the Netherlands as the basis for a national service there, and that's my warning that I really do need to wrap up. So one service, I'll say a little about data management planning. We have a service in the UK called DMP Online that helps us produce these plans that many funders are now asking for. It goes through the stages of creation. It can be tailored in many ways to suit the needs of particular universities where you may have specific advice that you want to give researchers about how to create their plans. It can be tailored as well to suit the needs of different funders, to include questions that are specific to those. You can share your plans with others in the project. It records who provides the answers to different parts of the plan, so it makes it straightforward to do that collaborative working that is so often important. And they can then be exported into both textual forms for inclusion in a plan and into machine readable forms that might help us monitor perhaps whether or not we've kept to those plans in future. That's all open source material. We're really interested in collaborating with others on extending the applicability of DMP Online. It's already being used, for instance, in the context of Horizon 2020 and supports the guidelines that the International Commission has there. Now, I believe you're going to be hearing, we've heard a little bit about Re3 Data already, another important service that helps researchers find an appropriate place to put their data. So I'm not going to, and I think we're going to be hearing more about it later on. We've got a speaker from Re3 Data elsewhere in the programme? Yeah, we have. So I won't go into that in any detail. I'll mention a couple of international organisations, the Research Data Alliance and CoData, that I think, if you're not already involved with, are increasingly important in coordinating some of this international effort, particularly through the working groups that bring together researchers and people from the infrastructure domain to try and define standards and deal with both technical issues and societal issues like legal interoperability when we're trying to produce and share data across many boundaries. I'll end with a very brief advertisement for one other area of international work, which is our own conference, the International Digital Curation Conference. That's taking place in London next February. Registration is now open for that, and in the interest of time, on our end. I hope some of that has been interesting to you. I hope some of it has been new. I can take questions now, and I'm going to be around for the rest of today. I'll be happy to take questions at any point. Thank you.
Kevin, thank you very much. So are there any questions? We still have time for, I would say, several questions. Yeah.
Regarding the return of investment, what kind of investment exactly? Was it the research data management, or what kind of investment?
So is that it, about the data centers and that study? Is that?
Yeah.
So those data centers are funded by research funders in the UK. So one by the Arts and Humanities. We have different research councils rather than the integration that you get with DFG. So it's simply looking at the amount of money that's put in by the research funders to keep those data centers operating. I think there is probably also some allowance for the costs of the researchers in getting data ready to go into those centres, but I must admit I can't remember the details of the methodology. It's true there are a lot of different ways of looking at the true costs of running something, but at least the methodology is open, and if you disagree with it, you can at least criticise it. But I think from our recollection, even if you might disagree with some of the detail of how they've measured costs, the effect they've measured is so great that altering the detail may turn the 400% into 300% or 500%, but it's not going to take away that very, very positive message that this is money that is well spent, and that the value of the data reuse we get is really high.
Are there any more questions? Then I will ask one more question. So you have let's say extensive experience with universities in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
So let's call it you established a research data management system at the university. Are there any experiences how many researchers are, or PhDs or masters or postdocs are actually using those?
Using those?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of actually how many have actually put data into a repository in a university, at the moment it's very small numbers, because the services in almost every case are very new. I think there are exceptions, perhaps one or two universities have had things called data libraries for many years. The University of Edinburgh has had one, for instance. But even those were not primarily used by people in the social sciences, I think. What is being used already is the training that's being offered, particularly the training for early career researchers that we also heard that DFG are focusing on. And our hope is that that's not going to make a difference necessarily this year or next year, but it is going to hopefully produce a new generation of researchers who think differently about data sharing. The effects that we've seen in terms of who's using it are very different for different disciplines. So there are some research domains where the demand for the university to do something already existed. Astronomy is one interesting area. Astronomers learnt some years ago about that very positive effect that putting your data in a repository increases the citation rate to your research. And the repositories that exist for astronomers at the moment really only, they tend to be very selective. You have to either use a particular instrument or you need to be funded by a particular funder. So there are many astronomers who don't have a home for their data, and they have been pressing the university to say, you must do something for us. And because astronomical data tends to be big, that's been a challenge for universities up until now. So they're people who are quite ready to use it. We don't have to persuade them of the need to do it. But in other areas, engineering's been mentioned, it's a harder task.
And then I have a second question, because we talked before about the incentives. Would you think that, which is popping up right now, that kind of data citation indices from say, commercial publishers will be an incentive for curation or data archive? Because if you are maybe indexed like now by an age index as a researcher, maybe additionally you have a data index of your work, would you think this would be a good incentive or?
Yeah, I have very mixed feelings about these, but I'm sure it is going to be a good incentive to measure this. On the other hand, I don't trust many of these metrics. I worry that we depend too much on them, that so much of research and of people's careers depends on things that are, we don't have a lot of evidence that these are good measures of something that we want. But there's no doubt that we need to measure something. We want to be able to measure, for instance, whether or not we're really enabling reuse. Is all this effort that we're putting in to increase data reuse actually making a difference? Because the business case for investing this money was predicated on that. I think what may help is more changing the acceptance of data as being a scholarly output that's worthy in itself. And that's about culture change. It's about making the promotion committees value published data in the same way that they value the written publication. And then perhaps whether or not we're using specific metrics, and then perhaps whether or not we're using specific metrics is not so critical. It's about it's a greater incentive to people to do the right thing because they know it will be valued. And that is a problem we have at the moment. I mean, you mentioned, I was interested to hear what you were saying about the Wellcome including this in their own interviews. I wasn't aware of that. The Wellcome have done a great deal to change culture around this. I wasn't aware of that one particular. We have a mechanism in the UK that's used to decide about that money that goes to universities every few years called the REF, the Research Excellence Framework. That's allowed people to put data into the evaluation process for some years, but so far not many people are using that, and I think they're worried it's because the people evaluating these things will not understand the value of data. That's something where we need to effect change.
Yeah, okay, so thank you very much, Kevin. There's another question.
I just had one comment. Jane Kramer.
Hello there, Jane.
Hi, I'm going to speak later on Friday, but from the U.S. perspective, I will share. I'm an academic, so at the university now we are having these discussions about promotion and tenure that are looking at the concept of alt metrics. I mean, I think probably a lot of you are starting to be familiar with this. So does data count? But also, is your work being tweeted about? How can we even get our heads around this? Is your work being talked about on blogs? Have you produced some kind of code? And still, it really is a generational thing at the faculty meetings I've been at. It's really interesting. But these conversations are happening, and I was at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I just moved to Drexel. Same conversation is happening, and so I suspect some of it is happening in EU universities. I don't know, but it's interesting.
Yeah, there's change taking place, but we don't know where it's going yet.
Okay, so thank you very much for your comments, Shane. So now we have a lunch break. We should thank the speakers in the first session again. I just learned that we have to start on time after lunch at 2:30 because Arnulf has to catch a train later this afternoon. So now we will have a 1 hour lunch break and we start at 2:30, and the lunch break is at the poster, so we also have a poster session now. So see you later. Okay.